Everyone talks about Dodo DNA. That's not the killer. The killer is the egg. No egg pipeline, no hatch, and without hatch, the comeback is dead on arrival. Tonight, we're doing this the hard way. Definitions, biology, and receipts. Because we have the genome is not the same sentence as we can make a bird. Here's the test. If this is real de-extinction, it must produce healthy birds, safely, repeatably, and at a scale that doesn't chew through animals like spare parts. If it can't pass that test, it's not a comeback. It's a headline with a lab coat on. So in this case file, we follow the chain from DNA to egg to chick to population. And right now, the chain breaks in the same place every time. The egg. Here's the claim people love. We'll rebuild the dodo from DNA. It sounds like a straight line, like the genome is a magic recipe and the animal pops out at the end. But DNA isn't a build-a-bird kit. It's closer to a blueprint, and a blueprint is useless without a factory that can actually manufacture the product. The actual lift is a chain of steps that all have to work in order. First, you need a high-quality dodo genome that's accurate enough to compare against living relatives. Then you need to identify which changes matter for a dodo body, not just random differences that don't affect the animal in real life. Then you need living cells you can edit and grow, not just any cells, but the ones that can become sperm or eggs. And then we hit the part most people skip because it's not sexy. You need fertilization, embryo development, a viable egg, incubation that doesn't quietly fail, and a hatchling that can survive and grow. De-extinction is not DNA exists. Its births happen. If births don't happen, the comeback doesn't exist. Right now, the strongest progress is on the information side. Scientists can reconstruct dodo DNA from preserved specimens and compare it to living pigeons. That's valuable because it turns the dodo from a myth into a measurable animal. It also helps answer a basic question. What living bird is close enough to even talk about editing toward dodo traits? The genetic story points to the dodo sitting inside the pigeon family tree, with certain island pigeons as its closest living relatives. That matters because if you're going to use a starting species, you want the closest one you can get, not because it makes the job easy, but because it makes it less impossible. But here's the catch. The moment you leave data and enter making a bird, you enter biology that fails all the time, even under normal conditions. Eggs fail, embryos stop developing, hatchlings die, and that's before you add the extra difficulty of trying to push one species' traits through another species' reproductive system. So yes, the science is moving, but most of what's moving is upstream of the real finish line. A genome is a step, it's not the comeback. Now let's talk about the part that decides whether this is admirable science or a moral mess. The surrogate animals. Any realistic dodo plan uses living birds as biological machinery. Birds that will be handled, sampled, sometimes hormonally manipulated, and put through repeated attempts until something finally works. And the scary part is that failure is not a side issue. Failure is the normal state. You don't get one clean try, you get a long series of tries, and most of them don't produce a healthy hatchling. Each attempt means stress, risk, and cumulative burden on real animals. A serious project needs hard rules before it ever celebrates a milestone. Limits on how many times an animal can be used. Clear welfare oversight that isn't run by the same people chasing the headlines. And a real stop line when the failure rate proves the tech isn't ready. Otherwise, bringing back the dodo becomes an assembly line of harmed surrogates for a press release. If the comeback requires suffering as fuel, it's not a comeback worth cheering. Even if you solve the egg problem and you hatch a dodo, you're still not done. Because a hatched animal is not a restored species. A species comeback is a long, expensive conservation program with a hype phase at the front and decades of work after the cameras leave. Mauritius today is not the Mauritius the dodo evolved in. The original story of the dodo's fall wasn't just humans hunting it. It was humans reshaping the island and introducing predators that could raid ground nests and eat eggs. That matters because the dodo's weakness wasn't being dumb. It was being a flightless, ground-nesting bird in a world that suddenly filled up with new predators. So, if someone promises, we'll put dodos back, the next question is, where exactly, and with what protections? Predator control, safe habitat, disease monitoring, and long-term funding aren't optional extras. They are the whole job. And then there's the uncomfortable detail people forget. One dodo is not a population. A handful of dodos is not a population. You need enough genetic diversity to avoid building a fragile, inbred group that collapses later. The comeback isn't a birth. The comeback is multiple generations that can survive, breed, and hold steady. Now we reach the true choke point. Why the egg is different from a womb. In mammals, you can often create embryos outside the body and then transfer them into a uterus. With birds, the reproductive pipeline is built differently. The egg is constructed inside the mother's body, layer by layer, and then the embryo finishes development outside the body after the egg is laid. That makes the problem brutally specific. It's not just make an embryo, it's make an embryo inside a viable egg system with the right timing, structure, shell, and chemistry to complete development and hatch. Small failures don't look dramatic. They just look like nothing happened, which is exactly why this is so hard. One approach people discuss is working with primordial germ cells, early cells that can become sperm or eggs. The idea is to get edited germline cells into a surrogate bird so it can produce donor-type sperm or eggs. On paper, it's clever. In practice, it's finicky, failure-prone, and hard to scale. And even if you get that far, you still have incubation and hatch success, where tiny variables can kill the outcome. So, when someone says dodo comeback, ask them one simple thing: show the egg pipeline, because that's the bottleneck that kills the comeback. Let's say the egg problem doesn't fully yield, but you can create a proxy, a living pigeon relative edited to resemble some dodo traits. What do we call that? That matters because words control what the public thinks they're buying. If it's mostly a modern bird with a handful of dodo-like edits, calling it the dodo is branding. It might still be useful science, but it's not honest de-extinction. It's a proxy, and a proxy has to be judged by proxy standards. What does it help us learn, and what conservation tools does it build that can save living species right now? Because here's the trade. Time, money, animals, and attention are finite. If we burn all that on a dodo-ish bird that can't truly become a stable, self-sustaining population, we've traded real conservation for a symbol. Wild ones. Quick note. If you like this receipts first style where we separate science from marketing, tap like so YouTube knows to push more case files like this. Alright, verdict time, and I'm going to be precise. On the claim that we can bring back the dodo as a true, self-sustaining species in the near term, I stamp veto. Not because the genome work is fake, and not because the dream is evil, but because the egg pipeline is the choke point, and it's not solved at the level you need for safe, repeatable, scalable births. If a project can't reliably produce healthy hatchlings without massive failure rates and heavy surrogate burden, it doesn't pass the test. And if it doesn't pass the test, it's not a comeback. It's a prototype. But I'm not vetoing the entire field. I give a green light to the parts that strengthen conservation tech for living birds: germline preservation, fertility tools, genetic rescue, and the ability to protect species before they become museum specimens. That's the version of this work that can pay rent in reality, not just in headlines. So, the Dodo case file isn't never. It's not yet. And until the egg problem is solved, Dodo comeback is still a promise, not a product. So here's where we land. The biggest barrier isn't imagination, it's the egg. If you can't reliably get from edited DNA to a viable egg pipeline to a healthy hatch, you don't have a comeback. If you want the full foundation, what we know, what we don't, and what de-extinction even means, watch my first Dodo case file next, because this episode is the bottleneck layer on top of that.